Here it goes. Start record. Oh no, am I frozen? Thank God. All right, everyone. Welcome to the 9th lecture for Human Motor Control and Learning. And in today's lecture, we are going to discuss practice conditions. So we've been discussing motor learning concepts from the midterm on. And today, we're going to be discussing how to sort of organize practice and what motor control theories and research has taught us about how to maximize our practice conditions to improve the efficiency of learning. The breakdown of today's lecture is going to be discussing practice variability, or the concept of practice variability, and then therefore how we organize practice to introduce variability. We're going to be talking about the limits of this idea of contextual interference, talk about practice specificity, the amount of practice, how to distribute practice, and how much time we should wait in between trials. And that's sort of the way that this lecture is going to be broken down. So before we start, I wanted to sort of pose a question to all of you. Look at these pictures here. So we have a soccer team, a football team, we have a hockey team, and then we have a rehab environment. And what are some of examples, or what are some ideas of the most effective practice strategies you would include to run practices for these different conditions? So Joshua, if you were going to, well, what's your sport? First of all, what is your something that you are interested in? Something that you could coach. Okay, perfect. So if you wanted to organize a hockey practice, I don't know, students or kids, how would you organize the different drills? Would you have like a scrimmage? Would you have them doing skating drills or shooting drills? Or how would you organize that based on what you want them to learn? So first, let's ask you a question. What do you want to teach them in this practice? And then how would you organize the variations of whatever practice conditions you're implementing to put that practice in place? You can come on the mic if you want. Okay, depends on age. Skill will probably work on plays, then skills. Okay. So based on what you're saying, and this is something that we would all probably agree on, that you want to break down the practice into components around the various skill that we've decided we wanted to coach or teach the learners or the patients. And so if you need to break down a skill, how will we organize, or how can we organize the practice to maximize the learning? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So the first concept that we're going to be talking about is practice variability. Now, with practice variability, what characteristics of practice could you change to optimize the learner's experience? Right? So if we have a skill that we wanted to teach, we have to consider initially what aspects of the skill performance we would want to vary. Because remember when I was talking about sort of academics and sort of learning courses, you want to challenge yourself and you want to, basically you want to take in as much information around certain topics to lead to a better memorization of those topics. With motor skill learning, remember, the cognitive process of learning is the most important, the trial and error. And so by introducing variations of the movement, by adjusting the environment or the situations of the skill, you are introducing more trial and error, more understanding of the motor skill. So variability, therefore, or variations in the skill that you are teaching are important for optimized learning. So how much variability then is optimal? And if variability is optimal and leads to better learning, as we know, then how should practice be organized to maximize this sort of factor variable? So when discussing the term practice variability in research or in motor learning, or when developing your practice schedule, practice variability refers to the variety of movement and context characteristics the learner will experience while practicing that specific skill. Okay, so Joshua, let's say you are teaching, let's say you said plays and skill. So let's say we're teaching them power play. What are some of the variations that you could practice of that type of skill? Because when we vary movement and context characteristics in practice, we can vary the physical context in which the skill is performed. So we can alter regulatory and non-regulatory conditions. We can also change the movement variations that are required in the test conditions. So that would be an example of like talking about basketball, learning how to shoot, but shooting from different areas on the court, for example. I think Joshua is just putting together an answer for us. But does that all make sense? Oh, in hockey, have plays in different zones and areas? Yeah, exactly. So you could change the areas of where they would be practicing, so the areas of the ice, the game situations. You could change the goal of the practice, so to score or to sort of cross the blue line or to get the puck back. So do we all understand, A, why variation leads to better learning efficiency, and what things we can alter in practice to introduce variability? You can alter the physical context or the movement variations of the skill. Does that make sense, everyone? Awesome. Okay. And so remember, the take-home point of practice variability is that by introducing variability, it introduces more error, right? So if you're adding variations of this skill, then the learner has to trial and error different things, and it's going to lead them to have a better understanding of their body and the movement and how to complete that skill. So in a way, it introduces their problem-solving ability internally, that ability to take a motor program and add in the parameters to complete that skill under varying conditions. This was a study investigating whether or not that was true. And in this case, what they were trying to do was teach non-skilled basketball players, people that have never, non-skilled learners, so people that had never played basketball before. They wanted to teach them how to shoot a free throw. And so a free throw is a closed skill. It's always the same, right? So you would think that by just having them shoot free throws, that's a skill, then that would lead to the best. But in practice, what they did was they did a difference between variable and constant practice. So constant practice would be only doing one shot and doing that over and over and over again. Variable practice was having them shoot from different areas in the court. So the variable group that was shooting, I think they did in front of, behind, and at the elbows. so they did all the variations of the different throws. They led to the best performance increase than did a constant practice. Interesting, right? What are some of the other reasons why sort of constant practice would be potentially non-beneficial when relating to like sort of attention? Not COVID. It's coffee. You don't want to miss my question? If you're doing constant practice, maybe you get the learners get bored, right? So by introducing variation, it allows them to keep attention on what they're doing because it's changing sort of situations. And we remember from the cognitive component of learning, keeping your attention on what you're doing is important. So now let's talk about how to specifically implement practice variability and what sort of learning research has taught us. Now, the characteristics of the skill in the physical contexts that you can change are going to depend or can depend on the type of skill that you're performing. So closed skills, you want to vary non-regulatory conditions. In closed skills with inter-trial variability, you can change regulatory and non-regulatory conditions, and the same thing with open skills. So here we have an example, and the example in this case is throwing a dart. So throwing a dart is a closed skill, right? So the board, the distance, the darts are always the same. And so the regulatory conditions, you do not necessarily need to change. Now this is, remember, we were talking about that study that talked about free throws, which is a closed skill, and how adding variation improved to better learning. That was going from a non-learner picking up the skill. In this case, we're talking about taking someone that once they've developed the motor pattern, how to sort of improve it. So with a closed skill, because in throwing a dart, you're always at the same distance and all of the regulatory conditions are the same, you don't need to vary them. What you can change are, so regulatory conditions in this case would be board height, distance, dart characteristics. They're always the same, so you don't change them. What we would alter, therefore, is the non-regulatory conditions, right? So you would vary the number of throws taken, maybe the game situation, so what they're aiming at, the presence of spectators, lighting, for example, the stress of the game. Those are things that you could alter to have them better prepared for the tournament or game or test situation. Here we have a closed skill with inter-trial variability. So in this case, that would be something like the fairway shot in golf. So remember, we were talking about golf and Gentile's taxonomy and how it's a closed skill, but every time you're hitting the ball, it is a different situation. So there's inter-trial variability. So in this case, you would change the regulatory conditions as well. Does that make sense, everyone? Awesome. So now that we're going to vary aspects of the skill and it's important for learning, how are we going to organize that variability? And so what is the question, therefore, is there a best way to organize this practice variability within the practice experience to maximize learning? And so the learning phenomenon that occurs with variable practice is called the contextual interference effect, right? So that's the term that's been talked about the most in the research. And so contextual interference is defined as basically the memory interruption that occurs with practicing variations of the same skill. So you have to basically reload the motor program. It's causing, more problem solving or more drawing everything from your memory. It's not like if you're doing the same skill over and over again, you can lose attention to what you're doing because you're just doing the same thing. You don't have to sort of calculate anything. By doing variations, you're constantly having the brain trying to put together things and implement that into the motor program that you've sort of remembered. Does that make sense? And so different amounts of contextual interference. So the difference in the amount of interference from variations occurs by adding more variability. So with multitasking, it's doing multiple things at once. And so with what do you mean by multi in terms of, you might be right, Jessica, but what do you mean by multitasking? Like in this situation, I understand is that in multitasking, you are switching attention back and forth between the different tasks, but really fast. Well, so that's so with multitasking, actually, you're keeping your attention on basically a whole number of things. So your attention's on all the things you're doing at once. And so depending on how much attention each thing requires, you may be able to complete all of them or not. And if you can't, then you're going to have to switch, yes. But in this case, you're keeping your attention on just one aspect, whatever you're practicing. And so you will realize, or we're learning, that if you are practicing one thing, so you practice it for a little bit, then you switch to another thing, then you switch to another thing. So you're only having your attention on one aspect of the practice at a time. But by switching that throughout the practice, it leads to better understanding because you're having to because you'll let's say we're practicing one aspect of skill, you tend to get it, right? You remember how so you practice an aspect of the skill, you're bad. Oh, I get it. Then you should switch to something else, or else you're gonna get bored and not keep your attention on what you're doing. Yeah. Perfect. Okay, awesome. So when there's variations or you're changing the parts of practice randomly, or when you're changing the parts of practice a lot, that leads to a high contextual interference. When the way that you're practicing is very structured and blocked, meaning that you're practicing the same thing for an extended amount of time, you're decreasing the contextual interference. So here we have an example to talk about the differences between the two. So here we have a hypothetical situation where you would want your students to learn how to throw a baseball. And so there's 3 types of throws that you want to teach them: overhand, underhand, and sidearm throws. Okay? Now, you have 6 days of practice, and each practice is 30 minutes long. Okay? If we did block practice is we would have 2 days where we do just overhand, 2 days where we do just underhand, and then 2 days where we just do all sidearm, right? If you look at random practice, see how we're doing each of the, yes, we definitely want high contextual interference leads to better learning. So in the random practice, do you see how we're still learning the 3 types of throws, but in a random order? So if you look at the amount of time spent on each throw, it's the same with block practice versus random practice. But then Tyler, which one would lead to a better learning and therefore a higher contextual interference? Yes. Now, remember that if you were to look at practice performance, who do you think would do better in practice? Blocked or random? Right. But just because the block did better in practice, you do put them in a test situation, and the random would actually do better because they've had better learning. So then Daniela, which of the two, so block practice versus random practice, is high contextual interference? Did you answer? No. So high contextual interference would be the random, because you're doing more variations of the skills you want to learn. So you're not. So if they did the same thing for 30 minutes, by the end of that practice, they're going to be bored and just going through the motions. By introducing variations, they can't do that. They have to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You're making sure that cognitively they're having to put attention on what they're doing and problem solving. Because remember that the cognitive component is what is leading to best learning. Serial practice is, if you can just see, the order is always the same. So it's somewhere on the spectrum between blocked and random. I have this video. It's really long, but I would look at it because it's cool to see how these principles are applied to everyday stuff now.
Motor learning is the study of how people acquire skill through practice. There's a massive gap, though, between what this science says and the way that we coach. Our mission at Train Ugly is to change that. So today we're going to be talking about block versus random practice and how to apply some scientifically proven principles to improve the effectiveness of practice. Let's do it. Hey, go, go, hey, go, go. So there are a few motor learning terms we need to understand as we work through this essay. First, practice performance. These are the short-term improvements you see during a particular drill or during a particular day of practice. Real learning refers to the improvements that we see the next day or during the actual game. Motor learning scientists use the terms retention and transfer to describe this real learning. This is simply describing the amount of improvements that we see during practice that show up the next day or show up during the game.
I think one of the most important things that the motor learning science has come up with isn't about how you look in practice, but it's how you perform later. And performance, which is always after practice by a day or a week or whatever, is best because you do things that have higher levels of retention. So that's a pretty key word. Does it promote better retention? Because it's not what they can do in practice, it's what they can do later on.
So as coaches, one of our main jobs should be to look at ways to maximize this retention and transfer so the improvements we see during practice show up on game day when the lights are on and your grandma's in the stands.
So Jessica has a question. So random practice is better for learning the skill, but what about if you are training someone who already learned the skill? Okay, so, but if you're training someone that's already learned the skill, what are you training them then? Chances are if you're training an already skilled individual, you're training them about a specific thing. So then you would want to do variations of that specific thing. The times where block practice is better is when you are initially starting off with beginners that have to quickly have more time to put together the movement patterns. So with very difficult tasks, then you introduce block practice initially and then get into random practice. So that way you maximize learning. This was a study that looked at badminton or teaching badminton to learners. And so we had beginner badminton players and they had them practicing short, long, and drive serves, so whatever that means, all from the left side of the court. And the test situation the next day would be serving from the left side. So it's a transfer test. And what they did was they compared random versus block practice, and the random practice group did better. So it supported high contextual interference for learning. Did I answer your question, Jessica? Okay, awesome. So then, Jessica, let me ask you a question, and the answers are on the slide if you want to read it. But why would block practice lead to poorer learning potentially? Now, I think I've mentioned it a couple times. But it's all related to potentially this whole attention thing. Learners may overestimate how they're doing. Yeah, because they're not challenging themselves, right? So they overestimate how they're doing or how much they've learned. And so they stop putting attention into it. They think they're that good and they just stop paying attention, right? And they lose that aspect of the problem solving or cognitive ability that's the most important for learning. So Jessica touched on this, but what are some of the limits of contextual interference then? So is there certain factors that we need to consider? Yes, high contextual interference leads to better learning, but what are some of the things that we should consider before making that sort of a law? And we need to consider the characteristics of the skill and the learner, because there's going to be certain situations where you want to start off with low contextual interference, okay? Some skills that are very, very difficult show that you don't want to start with high contextual interference because they're too difficult. Or if the learners are beginning or very young, they may need to start with low contextual interference to get the repetitions required to just get the baseline movement patterns down. Coughing. God. If they cough loud enough, they're going to scare all the patients. It's coffee. I need more coffee. So, this limits of contextual interference is called the challenge point hypothesis. So you want to evaluate the skill and the learners before just implementing random practice. With a difficult task or a low-skilled learner, you may want to start with low contextual interference just so that they develop the repetitions required to put together the sort of like the gross motor pattern or coordination, and then you introduce high contextual interference. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, perfect. Because there's studies that have looked at, so with this practice variability, how does it lead to better learning, right? And so we've talked about the ability to problem solve, more variations. You don't have time to lose attention on what you're doing. Doing variations may lead to a more elaborate memory sort of consolidation, which is true of academics when I'm telling you to sort of read around the topics, challenge yourself, cue cards, answer questions, teach it, do different things because it leads to a more elaborate representation in the memory. And this is the cognitive thing where we've talked about that by problem solving and by doing variations of this skill, you are better able to complete that motor skill under varying conditions because you've practiced those variations or you've practiced the problem solving ability. And this is just reiterating that fact. Any questions, anyone? Now, I forget, in lecture 7, I think that I said that practice specificity is important. So is that concept of practice specificity at odds with practice variability? And I had some students ask me a couple years ago, so I added in this slide. So practice specificity, talking about how you want the practice environment to match the test environment. We're talking about the sensory processes available. So that is more related to if we had, concurrent feedback in a practice situation, but all of a sudden in a test situation, you don't get that feedback, you've become dependent on that feedback. And so now you've learned less. That is what practice specificity is talking about. It's talking about the test performance. You want the same sensory processes that would be available during the practice and the test situation. So it's a different term. So in case you all were confused, that's what I meant by practice specificity. So practice variability is talking about the variations of the movement. And so you're doing variability to increase the problem solving or the trial and error. And that leads to better cognitive learning. So far, so good, everyone? Awesome. So now let's talk about the amount of practice that's required, okay? So it's not really in terms about like how much practice is required. It's about how to distribute that practice. So how much practice should people engage in? So things to consider would include the amount of time to practice each activity, the length of each session, and the rest between sessions, okay? Now, when we're coaching or have, our appointments in rehab, that's what sort of dictates the amount of time potentially that we have. So with talking about the amount of practice, we're talking about how to take the amount of time that we have and then maximize that. If that makes sense. So the first concept to understand is overlearning. And so that came from this idea of in research where they would look at the amount of trials required to get up to a certain performance level. So this came from a study from the US Army. And so they had initially recognized this. So they did a study to look at the number or amount of practice required for the cadets when they were in basic training, or I'm not sure what the term is, but the soldiers when they were in basic training. They taught them how to clean their guns and put them together. So it's a procedural skill, okay? And so they would count on average the amount of time it took for the recruits to learn that skill. So on average, it took, I don't know, let's say an hour, 2 hours, 10 hours, something, right? So what they would do is they would now say that, okay, that's the average it takes. We'll give everyone that amount of time to practice this skill. And then what they realized is that when the recruits were called to the Army base to get, go to war or whatever, they found that that skill, even though they had tested to see on average how long it took individuals to learn that skill, they found that they weren't remembering it. And so what they did was they put together what was called an overlearning strategy. So if you take the amount of time it would regularly take to get people or learners to get to a particular performance level, overlearning is continuing training past that. And so they implemented an overtraining or overlearning strategy of 100% more trials. So let's say it took 10 hours to learn this skill. They now made it 20 hours long. So they've doubled the amount of practice, and it led to the recruits knowing the skill, retaining that information better when they got called to the Army base to go to war. Does that make sense? So that's where the term came from, this idea of overlearning. And so overlearning or learning more than required seemed to, in this case for procedural skills, led to better retention. So overlearning is good, yes, right? But other studies have shown that there is a limit to overlearning, that too much learning is bad. How many of you have ever used the term, for that midterm, I overstudied? There's a point of diminishing returns. meaning there's a point that if you overlearn, there's a point to where your performance or learning starts to decrease. And why would that be? What are some of the reasons why that could be? Yeah, exactly. Fatigue. Because once you stop paying attention to what you're doing, you're going through the motions and then you develop bad habits. Probably all of those things. This study looked at so this is a dynamic stabilimeter. So they have to like balance like with their 2 feet on it. So that was the skill that they wanted to practice in the study. And then what they found was that 50% of overlearning was just as effective as 100% and 200% in terms of learning. But that they found that with the past 100%, on the test, they performed worse. There was a point to where you studied too much or practiced too much, and it led to poorer performance. Yeah, so it contradicts the soldier study. So maybe for procedural skills, because that was it was putting like it was a serial skill, putting things together. So maybe for that skill, in the Army study, maybe the overlearning of 100% is better for that, because other studies have found that 50% overlearning tends to be the high point. Everything more than that is not beneficial or detrimental. In a physical education class setting, there was one study that evaluated what to do during, so rather than have them practice specific skills, maybe you do overlearning by having the learners self-select what they want to do. So that because it's something that they want to do, maybe they will put more attention to it. So they did 100% overlearning, didn't see the diminishing returns, but that was because they were asking the students or the learners to pick what they're going to be overlearning. Does that make sense, everyone? So overlearning can lead to diminishing returns, and that's the key concept. Here we had a study, and this was moving a stylus a horizontal distance type of skill. And so what they did was they had the practice trials, you see here. So the number of practice trials were 42, 77, 102, 127, 152. And then they saw this diminishing returns. So at 50%, you saw that the performance on a transfer test was the best. And then as they did more and more practice, it led to them actually having poorer performance on the transfer test. So it's just illustrating this idea of diminishing returns past 50%. Does that make sense, everyone? And so we talked about the potential reasons as to why this overlearning more than 50% led to poor performance. Come up with other ideas if you want, but remember that the extended practice may prevent the learner from cognitively engaging what they're doing so they can develop bad habits or stop their learning. And by practicing the same thing over and over and over again, they're not having that problem solving, trial and error component that's so important with learning. So the next question there in terms of practice is how to distribute a practice. So what's the best way to schedule a practice given that you only have a certain amount of time? So is it better to have less frequent and longer practice, or more frequent or a larger number of smaller practices? Yes. And why do you think that is? Because we'll learn about it. Because what studies wanted to look at was the difference between mass practice versus distributed practice. So, you know, like those crash courses. So, you know, summer school, you do the same course every day for a week, or you learn like over a weekend versus, yes, it's more consolidation. Correct, Carolyn, yeah. So with studies evaluating the difference between what type of distribution of schedule of practice is the best, we're comparing mass practice versus distributed practice. And there's no gold standard to say that this is the numbers associated with a mass practice, this is a number associated with a distributed practice. It's just comparing longer and fewer sessions versus shorter and a greater number of sessions. Oh, there's more questions. Yes, that's correct, Carolyn. Yep, that's true, Sabanky. Last week they're doing similar practices with interference with learning. Is that wrong? Did we find that slide? What slide are you talking about, Jacob? What did we talk about last week? Okay. Just go through it and then tell me. So while Jacob was looking up that slide, do we all understand the difference between mass practice versus distributed practice? Or longer and fewer sessions versus a shorter and greater number of sessions? Everyone? Okay. Because research evaluating the difference in the distribution of practice has shown statistically and consistently that distributed practice is better than mass practice. So in this case here, we had, I'm not sure. Oh, this was the balance test, the stabilimeter from the overlearning study. They did that same board, and then they looked at the difference between distributed versus mass practice. So 1 day acquisition versus 2 day acquisition. And then the 2 day acquisition showed better performance in a transfer test. Here we had one study that was evaluating golf, so golf putting. And so what they did was they had 2 groups. The distributed group did 4 days of 60 practice trials, whereas the second group, which is a mass practice group, did 1 day where they did all 240 trials of practice. So each group did the same number of practice sessions, but the distributed practice did it over like a shorter amount of time over more days. And what the results showed was that on the retention tests, look at the difference. The distributed practice group did so much better. Okay, do you want to share your screen? Summary, augmented feedback. I feel like that's something completely different. Let me pull this up for you, Jacob. Lecture 8. Okay, stop sharing. It's okay, let's figure it out. Number 8. Slide 60. Okay, can you see this is lecture last week? Slide 60. So this is talking about this is talking about the frequency of feedback. Yeah, it's 49. It's 59 for me. But this isn't talking about the frequency of practice trials. This is about the frequency of getting feedback. So by getting more feedback, it leads to worse learning. Does that make sense, Jacob? So this isn't talking about, so this isn't talking about the number of times you practice. This is talking about when you're practicing, if you're getting feedback every trial. Oh, you did good. You should do this. You should do that. So then everyone in the class, why would getting, this is from last lecture, why would getting too much feedback or feedback too frequently lead to poor learning? Yeah. Yep, that's all correct, everyone. Good. And so in this case, what we're doing is we're talking about the frequency of the practice. So if you're doing it in a mass practice, you are probably losing attention on what you're doing. Wouldn't it be harder to have increased variability with practice shorter session compared to mass practice? Define what you mean harder. Like do you mean harder for the person or harder to put everything in? Oh, well, no, think about like mass practice think about it the way that we look at it this way. Here, see how it was 4 days of 60 trials versus 1 day of 240 trials? It's still technically the same amount of time. So, yes, for a shorter session, it's harder to introduce variability than it is for a longer session, but you would introduce the same amount of variability within the two. So that's a little bit of a different concept. So think about if you had the set amount of time required to introduce variability and required to have the amount of practice, whatever that number is it better to do that in smaller frequent sessions, or is it better to do that in one session? Do you understand the difference? So you need a certain amount of sessions to teach the people everything, plus have variations of this skill. So there's going to be a certain amount of things you need to do and how many cumulative hours that's going to take. So let's say it's 100 hours. So is it better to do it all in one 100-hour setting? That doesn't make sense. Is it better to do it in two? Is it better to do it in 10-hour sessions or 105 1-hour sessions, for example? So it doesn't make sense. Okay. Does anyone not understand that? Everyone's good? So overall, the take-home point is that in regards to the length of the session, if they're too long or too infrequent, it leads to non-optimal learning. Now, I asked you guys why this would be, and you all answered correctly and at different and for different reasons. And these are the three main reasons as to why mass practice leads to poorer learning and distributed practice leads to better learning. There's the fatigue hypothesis, and that by doing something for too long, you have decreased attention on what you're doing, and therefore it leads to less cognitive effort, right? So you're putting less effort into what you're doing, and then ultimately it leads to a poorer memory consolidation. Does that make sense, everyone? The last point is talking about how much time you should wait between trials. So you want to, like in the last study, there was 4 days of 60 trials or 1 day of 240 trials. How long should you wait in between trials? So what is the variables to consider when evaluating inter-trial variability? And the research has kind of been all over the board on this, but it's basically depending on whether or not the learner has motivation to keep going. In terms of when they have the motivation to start over again, then it's best to start the next trial. If they're doing like a very strenuous or a very long trial, they're probably going to want to wait a little bit longer before they practice again, right? So the amount of time that you should wait between trials in the practice depends on the type of skill that they're doing. So for continuous skills, they're typically longer. You want to have a longer interval to wait because it takes longer to probably do that skill. You can wait a larger interval of time between trials, whereas with discrete motor skills, you don't want to wait as long. But there's no set guidelines as to this. It's more, that's a general rule, but it is based on whether or not the learner has the attention or the motivation to continue. So if you can imagine a continuous skill, right? They're going to be tired mentally and physically after doing a trial. So you can wait long before starting off the next one. Whereas one that's very, very quick, you don't want to wait too long. You want to just keep them going. So they keep their focus on what they're doing. Does that make sense, everyone? Any other questions? Because that was a lecture. Told you. Awesome. Okay, everyone. Back to work. If there's anything, just email me.